Despite any fear, she fights. Despite any fear, she fights. Despite any fear, despite any fear, she fights. Despite any doubt, despite any doubt, she fights. Despite any doubt, she fights. Despite any doubt, she fights. Despite any hurt, 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 she fights. Despite any disappointment, despite any disappointment, she fights. Despite any disappointment, she fights. Despite any disappointment, she fights. Despite any stress, despite any stress, she fights. Despite any stress, despite any stress, she fights. Despite any rejection, she fights. Despite any rejection, despite any rejection, she fights. Despite any no's, despite any no's, she fights. Despite any no's, despite any no's, she fights. Despite any no's, despite any no's, she fights. Despite any criticism, despite any criticism, she fights. Despite any criticism, despite any criticism, she fights. Despite any setbacks, despite any setbacks, she fights. Despite any setbacks, despite any setbacks, she fights. Despite any setbacks, she fights. Despite any betrayal, despite any betrayal, she fights. Despite any betrayal, despite any betrayal, she fights. Despite any fatigue, despite any fatigue, she fights. Despite any fatigue, despite any fatigue, she fights. Despite any fatigue, she fights. Despite any negativity, 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 she fights. Despite any loss, 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 she fights. Despite any change, she fights. Despite any change, she fights. Despite any change, despite any change, she fights. Despite any heartbreak, despite any heartbreak, she fights. Despite any heartbreak, despite any heartbreak, she fights. Despite any pain, despite any pain, she fights. Despite any pain, despite any pain, she fights. Despite any fall, 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 she fights. Despite any battle, 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 she fights. Despite any moment of weakness, despite any moment of weakness, she fights. Despite any moment of weakness, despite any moment of weakness, she fights. Despite any failure, 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 she fights. She knows one day it'll be worth it. She knows one day it'll be worth it, so she fights. She knows one day it'll be worth it. She knows one day it'll be worth it, so she fights.